Hey y'all, what is up? Keasbey here. So today is going to be a bit of a history lesson, and we're going to be talking about the original Yata Lock and why you don't have to worry about that version of it anymore. But before we get into that, don't forget to drop this video a like and subscribe to the channel for even more. We've broken the 200 subscriber mark recently, and I really wanted to thank all y'all for your ongoing support. So, Yata was one of the first ever banned cards from the first ever list to include banning cards. So, let's look at this little bird. It's a level 2 Wind Fiend Spirit monster with 200 attack and 100 defense, and an effect that states you cannot special summon it, and it returns to your hand during the end phase. It was normal summon, flip summoned, or flip face up. Oh, and the unassuming effect that if it inflicts battle damage, your opponent skips their draw phase. Just reading that brings me back to 2003. Wait, no it doesn't, because this card didn't become a major source of Yu-Gi-Oh! Trauma for me until 2004 with the release of Invasion of Chaos and a little known card called Chaos Emperor Dragon, Envoy of the End. So, if you're listening to this and thinking to yourself, Chaos Emperor Dragon? That card kinda sucks. And 2004? You can't be talking about the pendulum version of it. Well, first, you've established an age gap between the two of us. And second, you have not seen the uneroded version of this card. So, unlike now where there's a myriad of conditions to his effect, the original CED was as simple as pay 1,000 life points, send, by the way, ahead of his time with non-destruction removal, everything on both fields and hands to the graveyard. That was it. No restrictions or anything. All of this on a 3k beater with the summon condition of having light in the dark and graveyard to banish. And factor in a much slower paced game at the time, CED was an absolute monstrosity. Okay, so you might be asking, what do these cards have to do with each other? Well, let's talk about the next piece of the lock. Two cards called Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest. I'll skip the drama for these and just say that the part of the effect that restricts you from using the effects of the monster you searched did not exist originally and was a later added errata to them. Also, neither were once per turn. Not really relevant here, but still cool to know. So, you know what falls squarely into both of their searches? Yata-Garasu. I'm sure you've pieced it together, but CED's effect can trigger either of these fellas' effects in order to give you a Yata-Garasu and a totally open field to poke in with very minimal setup, again, in a much slower version of the game where you could realistically set a Sangan or Witch and have it survive until the next turn. But what about cards like Book of Moon or Bottomless Trap Hole, you might think? Weren't those around? Don't those pose an issue for this combo you're so terrified of, Keasbey? Well, let's talk about the last player in this historical trauma, Ignition Priority. So, we've talked about turn player priority on this channel before, but let's do a quick review. Basically, at the start of every phase, turn player has priority to act. Meaning, for example, at the opening of the main phase, if it's your turn, your opponent cannot shotgun out effects until you commit a non-chain starting action and pass priority, or start a chain. Now, to review, things like normal summons or special summons that are not part of an activated effect, such as Cyber Dragon or, you guessed it, Chaos Emperor Dragon, do not start chains. Therefore, once these summons occur, you enter the summon window. Since no chain started, you, as turn player, have priority to activate a spell speed 2 or higher effect. And if you decline to do so, your opponent now has the opportunity to, either beginning a chain or should they decline as well, you re-enter an open game state in which you as turn player now have priority again. So, under current rules, you would summon CED, then once you've entered the summon window, you'd, within that window, pass priority to your opponent, who could then respond with a spell speed 2 effect such as Book of Moon or Bottomless Trap Hole, addressing the threat of CED since CED's effect is a spell speed 1 ignition effect. Well, ignition priority is a little bit different. Let's rewind that whole scenario. You, as turn player, summon CED. You now have said ignition priority. which means you can activate CED's Spell Speed 1 effect at the start of a chain here before your opponent can activate any of their Spell Speed 2 effects. This means two things. First, it means once CED hits the field, cards like the above mentioned Book or Hole will have their effects, but CED still has a chance to activate regardless. Secondly, it will mean the most clean out available at the time for CED was Solemn Judgment, not commonly played at the time, mind you, to prevent CED from even hitting the board. Ignition Priority was a weird rule, and it led to plays such as being able to normal summon Cyberstein, and then in the summon window use Ignition Priority to use its effect. Then if your opponent didn't respond, you could go Chainlink 2 Torrential Tribute to clear the board for whatever you summoned, since Torrential resolves before Cyberstein, and then have an open field to hit in with probably Cyber Twin Dragon. If you've never played in the Ignition Priority era of the game, lucky you, it was weird and I never thought it made much sense. So let's put together all the pieces and show the lock. We have a combination of pre-errata staples, CED, Sangan, and/or Witch, a much slower game at the time where again you could realistically set a monster and have it survive until the next turn, and Ignition Priority in order to make sure, realistically, the only thing stopping you from activating CED's effect was the not so universally played Solemn Judgment. So we set our Sangan and pass. Maybe we set a Sakuretsu Armor or Mirror Force just to make sure that we get to hold on to the Sangan until next turn. Our opponent also commits a T-set, not uncommon at the time. So our turn. Let's fire off another brutally good card from the era, Painful Choice, which will let us dump the light and the dark we need, or we could even use Graceful Charity to do the same with the upside of drawing 3 cards. However it happens, it wasn't overly difficult to get the needed light and dark in the graveyard. And again, I can't stress this enough, the format back then was much slower than it is now. So you had plenty of time to accomplish this. Well, now we have everything we need. Let's drop CED on the field and with Ignition Priority, activate its effect. So now, does your opponent have exactly Sangan or Witch set? Well, if they don't, that's game. The board and hands are cleared and you get to resolve your Sangan. So let's grab the Yata-Garasu, and you'll notice we've neither used a normal summon nor have we gone into the battle phase at this point. Let's summon out our Yata, poke him for 200, and then pass. So now our opponent skips their draw phase. Something of note, the game at the time really didn't have any relevant in-grave effects, let alone any that would break you out of the Yata Lock, so that was really it. Eventually you, as the one performing the lock, would draw into a Monster Reborn, Call of the Haunted, anything that could let you get special summons that you could speed up the clock and still be normally and poking with Yata turn after turn. It was such a known quantity that video games at the time would auto-surrender if you achieved the sport state. And this was a major part of what led to the very first ban list, in which Yata-Garasu was sent away for 18 years. So, the younger Keasbey just explained why he's terrified of Yata. Let's let the older Keasbey talk a bit about why he's not overly concerned. First and foremost, the Yata Lock most people remember is functionally impossible. Erratas have made that specific line no longer viable. That aside, there are a lot more ways to answer a Yata-Garasu now than there were then. I know, while it can be countered, is roughly the worst argument for or against anything in this game, but in comparison to back then when this was arguably a tier 0 deck, it was a world of difference. And we have loads of negations for starters, and the Graveyard and Banish pile are essentially second hands for some decks. Which brings me to my next point. Stopping your opponent from drawing was only half of the Yata Lock. The other, arguably more important half of it was removing all of your opponent's current resources. It is significantly harder to clear a hand consistently. Yata alone existed for some time before Chaos Emperor Dragon and didn't really see widespread play. Cutting your opponent off of new resources is all well and good, but you need to be able to also wipe out all the resources they currently have to really set the game into a lock. We've seen formats where wiping a hand was a meta deck. Look at Gumblar Loop or Infernoble. I know they did other things, but a big part of what made them so good was they created scenarios where you were just wiping away a hand before it could be played, greatly limiting what your opponent could respond with, and really just creating a game state where you could easily out-resource them until you won. We don't really have anything in the meta creating a scenario where your opponent starts a game with a 1 or 2 card hand, and based on that, you're really missing a key portion of the Yata Lock. Again, creating that game state in which your opponent has little to no usable resources. I also think that in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, if you can effectively create a game state like that, you've already won. And adding Yata to the mix is likely just one additional thing that you didn't really need. Even Fluandereeze, which I think is actually pretty effective at creating a game state where, even if your opponent has resources in hand, it can make them unusable, and where there actually is a fairly easy bridge to a Yata-Garasu, I don't think it needs it. Because again, if you're in a situation where your opponent's only remaining resource is their top deck, you can, in like 9 out of 10 situations, just continuously make 1-for-1 trades until you win. At the end of the day, I am excited to see Yata back, and I'm sure people are going to make it work and find ways to achieve new Yata locks. But I don't think that they're going to be meta-relevant or consistent enough for you to react the way 2004 Keasbey does. The long and short of it is, Yata is going to see play, but it isn't something that I think you really need to worry about too heavily. Because if we were in a metagame where Yata was going to be able to create the locks that it used to, we would already be dealing with decks that, on their first turn, were forcing you in a situation where you were playing with 1 or 2 usable cards most. It's been really fun to unpack a terrible memory of a not so fun time in the game for me, and I hope you all enjoyed the history lesson. Again, don't forget to drop this video a like and subscribe to the channel for even more, and I'll catch you all later.